Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take another look at Motive's remake of the 2008 horror classic Dead Space. But this time, we're going to stack it up against its spiritual successor, Striking Distance Studios' The Callisto Protocol, and see how it compares both visually and from a gameplay perspective. For this analysis, both games are being played and recorded on the PC, with the visual settings cranked up to their highest values at a 4K resolution. However, I will be disabling things like motion blur to capture cleaner still images for comparison. Also, as both these games are remarkably demanding, I'll be making use of features like Nvidia's DLSS set to its quality preset, and AMD's temporal upscaling solution FSR 2.0 in Dead Space and Callisto Protocol respectively. That being said, because both these solutions do introduce some visual abnormalities like artifacting, I'll be sure to disable these features when comparing specific object and character models. Alright, so let's kick this comparison off by first taking a look at the characters in each game, starting with the lead protagonists. First up, we have our old friend Isaac Clarke, a space engineer who's sent to repair a massive mining ship in deep space. To coincide with this unique occupation, Isaac's character model is purposely designed to look like a sort of utilitarian space welder, with his uniform being composed of various pieces of metal along leather and cloth liner pieces, which is then complemented by bright cyan blue lights for his health status, stasis module, and helmet. It's a very bold design, with the somewhat more relatable features being used to enhance the horror tone of the overall experience. And as we explored previously, the remake incorporates a wide range of visual eye candy to make the uniform really pop on the screen. Isaac's face, while only briefly shown throughout the game, is decent enough, with some nice eye rendering, facial geometry, and animation work. But then, when we swap over to Callisto Protocol, the difference in quality is night and day. Jacob Lee is up there as one of the more realistic looking human character models ever rendered in a video game. He looks nearly identical to his motion capture performer Josh Duhamel, and is animated in a way that expresses his various mannerisms both in cutscenes and throughout the course of normal gameplay. The complexity of the hair, the subsurface scattering, the way shadows are cast along his skin, and even the added detail of sweat dripping down his brow and cheeks all culminate in an incredibly lifelike protagonist to control. Following a brief introductory sequence, Jacob Lee is thrown into a massive space prison on one of Jupiter's moons, and is equipped with a prison jumpsuit for a large percentage of the game. The prison jumpsuit looks fairly simple in comparison to the wildly inventive engineering rig in Dead Space, with an orange stitched shirt over top orange trousers being consistent with what you'd expect to see in a normal, present-day prison on Earth. Though Jacob's back is where this outfit gets interesting, as there's this large metal ID tag harness attached to the rear of the uniform, which seconds as a holster for the various long weapons collected throughout the game. Even more interesting is this horizontal light bar on the rear of the character's neck, that just like the old rig from Dead Space, indicates the player's health at any given time, eliminating any on-screen HUD elements in favor of something more immersive. It's a very clear homage to the director Glenn Schofield's past experience creating the Dead Space series, which is a theme that will become even more evident the more we look at these two similar yet very different experiences. Like with the character's face, all of the bits and pieces that make up Jacob's uniform are richly detailed, even more so than the already very detailed engineering rigs in the Dead Space remake, which is surprising considering how much simpler the prison uniform design is overall. Halfway through the game, Jacob will suit up with a more advanced looking suit that gives off a slightly more science fiction soldier look than the uniform in Dead Space, but as far as the sheer volume of detail, there's no denying that the upgraded engineering rigs are more visually interesting than those in Callisto Protocol. Along with these fantastic character models, both games also feature some great supporting character model designs as well. In Dead Space, players will interact with a handful of characters like Hammond, Kendra, Nicole, and Mercer, all modeled after the respective voice actors. Like with Isaac, these models are decent enough, but they don't necessarily hold up that great when viewed in close proximity, which makes sense considering this is a third-person game that completely avoids any immersion-breaking cutscenes, leaving players to control the camera throughout the entirety of the game. Callisto Protocol takes a more traditional approach though, with dedicated cutscenes at key moments throughout the narrative. This makes quality character rendering even more important, which explains why characters like Danny, the Warden, Elias, and Ferris all look significantly better than their spiritual predecessors. Then of course, we can't talk about either of these games without talking about the revolting enemy types that players will be forced to endure. In one corner, we have Dead Space's Necromorphs, a horrific hive mind of mutant creatures that make use of human appendages to form unholy abominations. These creatures are designed pretty much exclusively around having long, deadly appendages like bladed arms and unnatural configurations of limbs, an important staple of the series considering dispatching enemies requires severing multiple limbs on each enemy. The skin along these enemy types also looks more stretched, often tearing at joints, revealing muscle and fleshy tissue due to the extensive mutation. Then we have Callisto Protocol's biophages. These are very similar to the Necromorphs, with their almost zombie-like behavior, but they do appear slightly more humanoid than their cousins. This is because the artists and designers would begin each enemy design with a basic human scan, which they would then add to with various horrific forms and mutations, often in the form of enlarged tumor-like growths along the body. Enemy skin appears more loose on these creatures, and blisters are often found all throughout, making them look a bit like Cronenberg's The Fly, as opposed to Dead Space's very clear inspiration from the likes of The Thing and Event Horizon. When it comes down to overall enemy variety though, Dead Space has the leg up, with a wide range of different enemies that all look and behave very differently from one another. Callisto, on the other hand, doesn't feature nearly as much variety. Most of the enemies faced are melee-focused grunts, with a few variations like the Big Mouth that can spit ranged attacks, and the Blind that function almost identically to the clickers from the game and show The Last of Us. There are a few similar enemy types between the two games, like the Exploder and the Combustor, both of which serve the same fundamental purpose, but are also just different enough. The Parasite and Swarmers are also very similar, though Parasites have a nasty habit of hiding in large crates when you least expect it, something that only rarely happened in Dead Space with the Swarmers. And finally there's the Brutes, that in Callisto have 2 heads instead of 1, and is slightly smaller overall. But both still serve as a massive tank-like enemy, dishing out massive damage and requiring a lot of firepower to take down effectively. In short, Callisto Protocol may have superior character model and animation design, but when it comes to the real star of the show, the enemies, more specifically the large variety of enemies, Dead Space appears to come out on top. Next, let's talk a bit about the environments players will explore in either game. In Dead Space, players are sent on a journey through a massive planet-cracking spaceship called the Ishimura, that has fallen into disrepair after an onslaught of necromorphs has more or less wiped out the crew on board. Despite taking place hundreds of years in the future, the Ishimura has a lot of familiar architectural design elements incorporated into it, echoing the kind of claustrophobic ironwork design elements found in modern-age cargo freighter interiors for areas like the engine room, engineering, and tram control station halls. This is then mixed with some slightly more sci-fi design elements in areas like the bridge, medical, and the overgrown hyperponics life support deck. It's not the prettiest setting, but serves as the perfect backdrop for the horror throughout the game, with lights flickering in near pitch-black corridors and blood smears along the walls. Occasionally, players are given the chance to venture outside into the void of space itself, which helps to break up the monotony of the core locations a great deal, and introduces its own set of unique gameplay mechanics along with it. Callisto Protocol, on the other hand, takes place mainly within a high-security prison complex on Jupiter's ice-covered moon, Callisto. It has a slightly more sci-fi feel to it, with things like security robots, more complex computer terminals, and 3D printers for the store kiosks, though at the same time, it does still feel grounded in our reality. It also has a similar dark and dirty feel to it, as the level environments are composed mainly of narrow halls and industrial zones. Locations throughout the game consist of the wide-reaching cell blocks, a medical bay, the biodome, various mining tunnels, sewers, and the docking tower. Though, because it takes place on a celestial body rather than floating out in space, there's no zero-G or spacewalk sequences. There is a brief sequence where players will be able to venture outside of the prison itself, but the suit that players are equipped with maintains oxygen levels infinitely, removing the dread of needing to rush around looking for oxygen like in Dead Space. This also leads into one of the bigger problems with Callisto, in that player freedom feels significantly more limited than in Dead Space. While there are several branching paths throughout the course of Callisto's campaign, these branches are often very underwhelming, with one path continuing the story, while the other leads to a small storage room with maybe a few health injectors and ammunition. Even the original version of Dead Space didn't suffer from this problem as much, as the ship's chapter-by-chapter design gave the impression that you were fully exploring the ship from top to bottom, with central hub areas often branching into multi-part objectives before returning back to the tram to move onward. The remake expands on this even further by adding in connector hallways between each chapter, effectively connecting the entire ship together into one seamless environment, though it is still paced similarly to the original, meaning these areas will need to be unlocked one by one in accordance with the narrative. Either way, the Ishimura is a far more interesting location to explore, which benefits Dead Space greatly over Callisto Protocol when it comes to replayability. As for the visual quality of these environments, it's safe to say that Callisto Protocol once again has the upper hand, with some beautifully detailed locations that steadily become more and more overgrown with the biophage plague, transforming it into something even more horrific. There's a similar element built into Dead Space as well, as return trips to the medical bay and bridge are transformed by increased tentacle and tissue growth along the walls. But Callisto Protocol does take it a step further, with all of these disturbing, destructible pods growing out of the walls and on the floor, the larger of which sometimes house deadly creatures that will latch onto the player and pull them inwards. Next, we have lighting. Callisto Protocol's lighting is gorgeous, with a fantastic contrast between light and dark, combined with effective use of volumetrics and reflective surfaces. Every scene is brimming with light, all while still maintaining a proper dark and terrifying atmosphere. The Dead Space remake is no slouch in this area either, as the dark hallways and shadow rendering looks phenomenal in most instances, and shines even better in others. But then there's the problem areas like the screen space reflections that I mentioned in my last video, that rob certain scenes of their impact. Callisto Protocol surprisingly suffers from a near identical problem, most notable in its final act, as the reflections have this unnatural fuzzy look to them that is constantly reverberating as the camera moves in the scene. Thankfully, in both cases, this particular issue isn't too prominent to be a major drawback. It's just surprising to see in Callisto considering its great use of screen space reflections in combination with some ray trace reflections all throughout the rest of the game. Almost every puddle, mirror, and pane of glass has at least some form of ray tracing at use, usually for only base models and not the more intricate textures. But even with these considerations, Callisto is an incredibly demanding game to run at these quality settings. In one area, I had the framerate drop into the low 30 FPS range, even with DLSS enabled, no doubt caused by the large amount of volumetric light, shadows, and ray tracing options. It's still playable, but average performance was considerably lower, and so these much more advanced lighting options, while definitely superior to those in Dead Space, are likely not going to be accessible to a large group of players. Shadow quality is more or less the same deal, as Callisto Protocol seems to mix together traditional projection methods with ray trace shadows to create more stunning results. But then there's areas like this one, where a critical shadow used deliberately to tease an enemy around a corner looks terrible projected on that intended surface. The effect really breaks down when cast over a larger distance, something that the Dead Space remake, using its more traditional shadow projection methods, does not suffer from. Next up, we have the other miscellaneous effects. Now, here we have a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, Callisto's explosions, sparks, and fluid physics simulation, along with its ground deformation, are a major step up, especially considering Dead Space doesn't feature any of these latter effects at all. Fog and smoke effects are also much thicker in Callisto Protocol than what we observed in Dead Space, and is also used much more effectively in certain scenes, especially this one, where it's used liberally to transform this hallway into something much more terrifying. But then there's effects like environmental fire that pale in comparison to similar effects shown in Dead Space. Gore effects are another area where I feel Dead Space has the upper hand, as the layered enemy skin design is much more visceral than the almost dry, unimpactful dismemberment on display in Callisto Protocol. There's of course outliers all throughout each title, but overall, I'd have to give it to Dead Space here, as the gore is undoubtedly one of the biggest components of either title. Next up, let's talk about the gameplay mechanics in each of these two games, starting with the core abilities and movement. At first glance, it would appear as though both games would play about the same. Both have the main character offset to the left with a over-the-shoulder camera view, but Jacob's movement feels a bit more fluid and natural than Isaac, with more complex animation loops, especially in how he occasionally looks backwards when slowly moving through new environments. Jacob can also crouch to sneak around enemies, crawl through ventilation shafts, and vault up onto ledges. But a big downside to Jacob's movement is that he feels considerably more sluggish than Isaac. Using the default camera and movement sensitivity, Callisto Protocol makes it feel like you're constantly trying to push the character in the direction that you want, with slow response time and really delayed action. Combat is snappy when it needs to be, but general traversal feels very slow and cumbersome. But Dead Space doesn't suffer from this particular problem. Isaac moves as expected, and interacting with anything is nearly instantaneous. Simple objects like boxes do require Isaac to walk all the way around to bypass, but the level environments are designed in a way that prevents this from ever feeling unreasonable. But that's nothing compared to how wildly different the combat behaves in either game. In Dead Space, combat is handled with a traditional over-the-shoulder shooter mindset, with the only catch being that players need to cut off the limbs of enemies, rather than just simply aiming for the head. Throughout the game, players will uncover new weapons to deal with different threats, like the automatic pulse rifle, the flamethrower, a force gun, ripper, and the contact beam, all of which can be upgraded using found power nodes and workbenches. But in Callisto Protocol, gunplay is treated as a last resort. Instead, players must rely almost exclusively on an upgradable stun baton, and engage in melee combat with foes using a simple dodge and strike system. After dishing out a successful combo, a blue crosshair will appear on enemies, indicating that the player can quickly auto-aim at a weak spot and deal bonus damage with one of their sidearms. But using these guns outside of the melee system is often unwise, as enemies take considerably more bullets to take down this way. Firearms include the hand cannon, the skunk gun, the riot gun, the tactical pistol, and the assault rifle, though these aren't nearly as varied in terms of their capabilities, and can be interchanged with most enemy types. Weapons in Callisto can also be upgraded, but the system is simplified as well, by means of a revamped store kiosk menu, where players need simply pay with found Callisto credits to 3D print new attachments. There is a store in Dead Space as well, but it's used only to purchase weapon upgrade blueprints and standard supplies, allocating all specific weapon upgrades to the workbench instead. Another interesting similarity between these two games is the inclusion of a special telekinetic power tool. In Dead Space, this comes in the form of both stasis, to slow down objects, and kinesis, which can be used to pick up and throw smaller objects at tremendous speed. In Callisto, however, there's only the grip glove, which functions a lot like the kinesis module, but can also pick up living enemies as well, and can be used to launch enemies into environmental hazards like spikes or spinning blades. It's a more powerful tool overall, but is greatly limited thanks to a low recharge rate by default. When considering all of these gameplay elements, I think it's safe to say that Dead Space still manages to hold its own, and offers a more varied and arguably more enjoyable experience. The combat in Callisto is certainly interesting, but the dodge left, dodge right mechanic becomes overly repetitive early on, and is used extensively throughout the entirety of the game. The stealth mechanics are a nice touch, but they feel crude when compared to other stealth-oriented games that have come before it. And by simplifying the upgrade system to only a single kiosk, with a set of weapons that are all equally useful, and only a single armor upgrade tied to the story events, there isn't as much of a sense of progression when compared to the plethora of upgrade options available throughout Dead Space. And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, I was pleasantly surprised by the visual appearance of Callisto Protocol. Considering how impressive the Dead Space remake was, I really wasn't anticipating a game to look even better. But Callisto pretty much locks down each visual category against its competitor with room to spare, especially when considering the quality of the character models, the lighting design, and many of the unique effects. but the Dead Space Remake still holds its own in the areas that I feel count the most, as the environment is significantly more interesting to explore. The atmosphere evokes a greater sense of dread, and the gameplay design is simply more entertaining. I certainly respect Callisto Protocol for trying to do something different, and the presentation for these new gameplay mechanics is impressive for sure. But the clunky controls, remarkably demanding high-end settings, and overly linear experience leave a lot of room for improvement than its predecessor ever did. But what do you guys think? Do you prefer the newer Callisto Protocol, or have you been enjoying your return visit to Dead Space with the remake? Let me know in the comments section, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this posted every week.